Thank you, Sivia. Hello, everybody. Glad you're here for another Lunch and Learn. Today, we're going to be digging into running security and compliance checks pre-deployment on Kubernetes Manifests using the open source Regula policy engine, which is built on Open Policy Agent. And we'll also look at how to kind of tie some things together using the Fugue SaaS platform as well. We've got Ricardo Green on to walk us through that. If you hear my crazy, insane dog upstairs making all sorts of nutty noises, she's waiting for her breakfast, and it's coming through the floor. So please forgive that.
Better your dog than mine this time.
Yeah, Darla's insane. So yeah, before we dive in, just wanted to throw a couple of public service announcements out there. Here we go. So we have some cloud security resources available to you. First, we'll start with the Cloud Security Masterclass series. Next Wednesday, November 17th at 12 noon Eastern, my colleague Josh Stella is going to be walking through how to understand and minimize your blast radius in your cloud environment. This is sort of how to make sure that, you know, if your environment is breached, that the damage that can be done is minimal in such an event. It's going to be really awesome. And we've got a bunch of other masterclass sessions available on demand. We also have the State of Cloud Security Report 2021, where we surveyed a number of cloud engineering and security professionals about the challenges they're seeing, as well as sort of how they're managing that. It's very insightful. And finally, we've got the Engineer's Primer on Cloud and Infrastructure as Code Security. This is hot off the press. Get your hands on that as well. So with that all out of the way, why don't we dive right in? Hey, Ricardo, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Awesome. Let's I guess take a little quick overview of Regula and what it is, how it works, and dive right in.
Yep. So I'm going to go off camera just because I don't want to see myself in the corner of the screen. So first of all, again, thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day to join us. These are always pretty cool sessions, primarily because I think our previous session, we talked about Regula, we talked about inspecting Terraform files. And I think at that particular time, we said, and soon we'll be doing, be able to inspect Kubernetes configuration files manifests. And in many companies, those things are 6 months, a year, they don't come to fruition. So it's really cool at Fugue. We continue to iterate on our product. We continue to improve it. We continue to add features, and it's all within the same platform, essentially, and then being able to extend it to other areas of infrastructure as code. So I'm going to talk through a couple of slides, and then we'll jump right into it, just with some examples, talk through how you can get it. We'll talk through some rules, integration with our SaaS platform, so you'll be able to see that as well. So lots of cool stuff we'll cover, and we'll definitely leave time for some questions. So if you do have questions while I'm going through a lot of this, you can just put your question in the chat. I don't know if folks are open. I think we probably have everyone muted, but just post in the chat. I don't mind jumping around, showing different things, so we can absolutely do that. But first, so we'll dig into the slide. So the way that Fugue has essentially approached cloud infrastructure security and infrastructure management is as a software problem. So there are so many different ways as we become more efficient, as we increase our ability to accelerate how we deploy resources. We do it all through software. We're expressing everything as infrastructure as code. So we want to be able to impact that at every phase of the software development lifecycle, also known as the cloud development lifecycle. But essentially, you will have repositories that will contain your infrastructure as code, referencing your Kubernetes files, as also and also including your application file. So your application code all being deployed in a single repository and everything needing some level of inspection. So the way that we impact that is by looking at the infrastructure as code, being able to look at everything before we even deploy it. So just looking at this diagram, we see, initially just at the development phase. So how do I extend some of this information, the ability to inspect these files with the developer? So early in the development process, as I'm working on a Terraform file, I want to be able to check it. I want to be able to see if what I'm attempting to deploy or what I'm planning to deploy meets not only my corporate objectives, but any sort of best practices. And that's going to be done at the development phase. When we look at deployment, that's when we start talking about automating things. So how do we create gates that will restrict my developers or operations team members or DevOps team from deploying resources that are non-compliant or that are configured in a vulnerable state? How do we avoid that? And we do that in the deployment stage. So using tools like Circle CI, having a stage within Jenkins that will inspect our infrastructure as code and to be able to stop it if certain violations are found. That's how we're handling it at deployment. And then we look at the runtime. So the resources that I have deployed in the cloud environments, I want to be able to inspect those against our best practice, to inspect those against any of our corporate governance objectives, and do that at the runtime in a continuous manner. So we're talking continuous scanning, we're talking on-demand scanning and evaluations, we're talking about capturing drift. So when things change, how are we alerted to those things? So Fugue actually allows you to do all of these things within all of these development phases. When we look at the bottom, just the check marks, are we able to do it at IAC? Can we create pre-commit and pull request checks? Absolutely. Can we inspect the infrastructure as code? Pre-deployment checks in our CI? Absolutely. Do we have the runtime, the ability to check things in a runtime on a continuous deployment basis? So as changes are happening, are we able to pick up what those changes are? Are we able to report on those changes? And how do we, and also aggregate that information into our reporting? We absolutely can do that. And then just the continuous runtime check. So even when things aren't changing, if we are continuously monitoring, we are seeing if for some reason, a bad actor is there and makes changes to configurations, and we're able to capture that. So all of that, all of those capabilities are there. We are not going to talk about all of them today. We're going to focus heavily on this deployment area, or I'm sorry, development area, and we'll touch on some deployment aspects as well, but heavily focused here. So let's talk about Regula. So what is Regula? And I'm going to try not to read it, but actually it's written so nicely. So essentially Regula is an open source policy engine for checking infrastructure as code. So what Regula does is Regula is built on Open Policy Agent. And what that allows us to do is any sort of resource types that are declared in your infrastructure as code files, we have the ability to check those. So if you can imagine even Terraform, as well as with Kubernetes, with your YAML files, you have declarations of specific resource types, services, service connectors, all of those different things that are going to be part of your Kubernetes files are what you're going to declare. And we can create, some of them are done on best practices, and we'll see that, which is integrated into the platform itself. But you can determine that there may or may not be certain configurations that you want to avoid, or configurations that you feel as an organization are vulnerable and you want to avoid those things. So whether it's naming convention, whether it's certain port openings that you want to restrict, you have the ability using Open Policy Agent to create those sorts of rules and to have Regula actually enforce those rules. And I'll go into some additional detail in terms of how you would actually handle the enforcement. It does support simple and multi-resource checks. You will be able to create certain patterns and do comparison operators for certain attribute settings that are there, that are present. So very common within, even a cluster deployment where you may have certain IAM policies that you don't want associated with a certain cluster. You can write those things using Open Policy Agent. If you have certain resource types, say in your VPC configurations, or permissions associated with what can write to an EFS volume or something like that within AWS, you can create those sorts of relationships and comparison operators using Open Policy Agent. So it's a very powerful language itself as a query language, but you have the ability to inspect all of these things pre-deployment so that these sorts of vulnerabilities aren't getting into your runtime environments. So just a couple of different things to touch on this side. There is within it, we won't be talking in detail today about it, but a test and debug framework. So, and I'll show you actually where we can get more information on that, but really being able to create tests or write tests as you create rules, writing tests for those rules. You can even automate that, and that can be part of your pipeline checks for writing, new rules. Ultimately, what we see is that customers will get to a point where they are treating their rules, the code for their rules, like any other pipeline deployment that you may have. So centralized management of those rules, syncing those rules within the Fugue platform, updating those rules via pull request, and then resyncing, once all the tests are passed. So that sort of process, the DevOps process, Regula is built for that. And that's part of the open policy or the open source components of it. And I'll show you where you can find more information and dig into that as well as part of this session. And I think that's it for the slides. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and we will jump into some of my other screens. And I'll also take a quick pause. Let me know if there are any questions, Drew, and we can talk through the questions as I'm pulling things up.
No questions as of yet, but everybody please comment about your, if you have any questions about your specific use case and how this might apply, or any sort of comments you'd like to weigh in on. We welcome those. It makes it more fun and interactive.
Otherwise, we feel like we're just talking to each other. You're supposed to cue the automated laughter at that one.
Hey, Sylvia, get some canned laughter ready next time.
All right, so we'll start here. So this is all the documentation for Regula. A couple of things to point out just at the onset. This links directly to our GitHub repository, which I have open, and we're going to jump into that as well. This is extremely informative, so we can go through so many different aspects of it. So rule writing, we'll actually take a look at the rules, how you will install it. So I'll talk through all of those things as well. You can see the current version is 1.6. I know we are releasing this somewhat in a similar cadence with the releases that we have for our SaaS platform, and we'll actually take a peek at the SaaS and show the full integration of it as well. So, definitely stay tuned. There are other versions we see a bunch of forks. Stars are all appreciated as well, as more and more folks are using it. And you can actually see some other projects that other folks have created with Regula as a foundation for that. In terms of getting started, essentially, Regula is a pretty straightforward install. The previous page, it's a Go binary, so you can download it directly from the releases page, or you can do a brew installation. So really nice and easy there. And this is where we talk about installing this for individual developers. So we definitely encourage individuals on your teams to actually have this locally. So, and this is the example that I'll show. You can also install this directly on your CI platform. So an example that we will be updating shortly, you do see some integration examples here, but you can actually just create an agent within many CI systems that just has Regula installed. And then at that point, you're just doing the command. So it's just going to be similar to any sort of testing framework that you would have installed on your CI platforms today. Regula just becomes another testing framework, so to speak. Once we have everything downloaded, it's just installed to your path. And then we get into usage. So there are a number of different things that you can do. And I'm going to switch screens and show you and pull up kind of the help screen, the flag that we would use for that. But you would see a number of different things. So if we talk through just some of the commands, initializing it, you can actually create a configurations file. So the configurations file is set up so that you would have an environment ID, which would correlate to what's in our UI. As well as any sort of waivers that you might have or any rules that you want to include. All of that would become part of your configurations file and you can set that up. You can run OPA tests. So with that, there's also a REPL. So you can do an interactive session testing things within it. So it's very, very informative, very powerful. There are a ton of things that you can do. I'm going to actually flip back, but we'll go here first. So when we have this installed, we see our Regula version. Really straightforward. So what I am using is our enterprise version. The enterprise version, very similar to the open source version. The primary difference is this full compliance mapping. So this would map to all of the different compliance frameworks that Fugue evaluates. There's roughly about a dozen of them. Won't go into detail on those there, but we can certainly, if you have an interest of a specific framework, if you want to post that in the chat, off the top of my head, HIPAA, ISO 27001, NIST, the CCM version, CIS Docker, there are a bunch of them. So if you have a question about, whether we have the framework that you are interested in, just let us know and we can respond in chat. Once we get to actually evaluating files, it is there are certain commands and flags that we will use. Hopefully this is big enough for viewing. I'll make this a little bit bigger, might be easier to see, but we'll go through the different options that you would have when you actually do run these evaluations. So when we look at the input types, Regula will automatically search the directory that it's in for any of the specific file input types. So we'll look for CloudFormation files, look for Terraform files, look for Kubernetes YAML files. If you only want to look at a specific input type, then you would just specify that input type, and that flag is here. Just the input type flag would just be a string value, which would correlate to something there. In terms of the output format, so this really comes down to what you are going to be doing with the information. So in most cases, when you are doing this locally, your output format is just going to be a convenient text format, which is just going to give you some information about all the violations that are uncovered in the specific files that are being evaluated. So that's going to give you that text format. If you are, say, maintaining some reporting offline, maybe it's an artifact for each run that you perform that you want to maintain within the CI system or send to an S3 bucket or some other storage, you may want to do a JSON output. So we'll look at that. But essentially, the JSON output is going to give you every rule that's being evaluated. So it's going to be a pretty lengthy report with passes and fails for every evaluation that's being performed. You could do a table format, which is really a nicely formatted. If you have a larger screen, which I'm just doing this directly on my laptop screen. But the table format is really nice in that it just lists everything that's evaluated, gives you a pass fail, per rule evaluation, and has some additional information. And then depending on, what the next stage or what tool you might be using to actually parse or interpret some of the output, you might want it in an XML format or a TAP format. The compact format is just a smaller kind of human-friendly version. of the text format. And this is where it gets really interesting. So we have some severity flags. So when you use the severity flags, you are telling Regula that based on the severity of the findings, we are going to fail that build. So Regula out of the box will, whenever there is a violation, it will not exit with successfully. So it's not going to be a 0 exit code to proceed to the next stage. So this is how we can create build failures. This is how we can stop builds. This is how we can set up a pre-commit hook based on the fact that if there are violations, we're not going to proceed. This is all set up based on essentially an equal to or greater than. So if I set this up with a severity level of low, any sort of low violations will get flagged along with medium, high, and criticals. If I do it at a high, only the high violations are going to stop my build. High and critical will stop the build, and then we will not exit successfully. And this is important. So as you think about operationalizing the use of Regula, it's really important to communicate with folks on your team to let them know what will actually trigger a build failure stoppage. And this is essentially, the way that we see it is it starts to create best practices. So your internal customers, as we'll call them, will start learning what to do and what not to do, what is what's going to pass muster and what's ultimately going to fail and not allow those builds to proceed. So just very informative there. Here we see a couple of different other things where we do have the ability to disable the built-in rules. So what we could actually do is if we have a set of, say, best practices that we want to enforce outside of, say, what Kubernetes, what CIS Kubernetes does, then we can absolutely just enforce those specific rules. We disable the internal rules, and we're just evaluating some of the custom rules that we create. So I will take a quick pause there. Any questions before we proceed?
Still no questions.
Everybody's mesmerized.
I'm mesmerized.
So if we look at the rules list, and this is kind of a really cool aspect of doing things kind of open sourced and making, information available and obviously making, as we contribute to the community and contribute kind of in this cloud security space. I often just think it's really cool, just the way that we do this. A lot of it's open source. Not only does it tell you kind of what's being evaluated, but as you'll see, the source code is there. So as we all learn more and more about Rego and Open Policy Agent, how to write rules, how to write better rules, we basically give you kind of a blueprint for getting up to speed on those things. But so when we look at these rules out of the box, we will see things here. So we will, if you just go through, these are all mapped rules, and I'll show you where they're mapped, but these are all CIS Kubernetes. So, when we think about CIS, it's best practices, but I'll just scroll through here. You'll see severity rating for a lot of these rules. For all of the rules, essentially. And you'll also see a Fugue rule ID. So one of the things to note within the Fugue, all of the Fugue rules map to a Fugue rule ID. Some of these rules or controls are overlapping with other frameworks, but everything will have a single rule ID, a Fugue rule ID, which is used for a number of different things. So you could actually use this as a waiver. This also correlates to everything we have in the SaaS. This also correlates to any sort of remediations that are created for these rule violations. So these are things that we have created within Fugue. This is all open. So fixing certain violations, you will be able to find those fixes within our documentation. We also link to it directly within our UI. So you'd be able to see that as well. And again, as I referenced, this is all in this repository, which we'll go to shortly. So how do we run these things? So if we look at the different files that we have within, any sort of repository. Obviously, this is going to be local. We can run, regular run and specify, any specific file that we're looking at. So if we look at my editor here, we have a couple of different things. So this is a very simple, straightforward configurations file. If we do a regular run, then we specify our learn file, and then we can modify the format. We'll just do the text format, but we run this. It looks at my configuration file, which I created earlier. And then we have these rule violations that are here. So it's always amazing to me, just the size of the file, which this is just a single pod that's being deployed, but just through the depth of the evaluations, whether it's the metadata, whether it's, specifying things in the security context, Regula is going to pick up on all of those things. So these are all of the violations that we have. And we see that here, we get a reference to, where they are in the specific file. So the line reference there. We can also run this, get our, and we get our JSON output. So this is going to give us a little more detail. And as we scroll through, we get, more details. Obviously, we get the information regarding the file path. The input type, as we discussed, is Kubernetes. The specific resource ID is represented there. So we can always refer to the section or subsection within our YAML file where that violation exists. And then the detail rule description is represented here. So this is going to tell us that the pod should not run containers with the net raw capability. And then the Fugue rule ID. So this is always important for reporting. This also correlates to what we have in the SaaS as well. So, and we'll actually jump to that and show this. So we'll copy that. We'll see that this is a fail, but all this information obviously is going to be detailed for us. This is going to map directly to the CIS Kubernetes. So all of that rule and mapping information is there as well. And that obviously is going to lead into how we report for that. This is something that you may want to export. So as you do these runs, you may send this output to store it as a file. And every run that you perform, whether it's locally or through your CI system, this could be the report that is maintained. We have other customers that will use this, and this is what's going to be evaluated at an approval stage. So you may run your build. You don't have, you decide that Regula is not going to fail the build, but you are just going to pause it. You'll maintain this report so that a human has to come and read the report and to determine whether we're just going to accept the risk to allow this build to proceed. So a number of different things that you can perform or you can set up for that. You also have a number of different checks here, which is going to give us our fails, our past. We'll see if we have any rules waived. We also get severities, and we can see that these are all medium severities. So when we go into the SaaS platform itself, which will go here, these are all going to be set up as repository environments. So a repository environment is essentially the infrastructure as code evaluations that are being performed. So, and this is part of the enterprise version. And this is when we start maintaining these reports. So you can maintain these reports externally, but you could also have Fugue actually maintain all of these reports. So if we go to this specific repository, this is what we've set up for our lunch and learn. And then we can see, we are deploying, and there are a couple of other files in there. There are 29 resources that we are deploying. We see a number of compliant, a number of non-compliant, and then we have basically looked at all of our different compliance frameworks. There's a Terraform file in there as well. So we're going to evaluate that file for compliance and non-compliance because it's all in that folder. When we talk about the rules, they are found here. So every rule that Fugue performs evaluations on are going to be found here in our rules section. So every rule has a category. Obviously, Kubernetes is the category here. We have a severity level, and then we have that Fugue rule ID mapping. We see the Kubernetes control specifically, Kubernetes version 1.61, control 5.2.7. And then we have our remediation steps and documentation. So this is available for every non-compliant evaluation, where you have the ability to see exactly what is being evaluated. This is where we have listed remediation steps. So this is going to refer directly to what you need to correct in your YAML and the manifest configurations file. And we see that represented here. We also have additional links, which will take us to the Kubernetes documentation. Excuse me. And then, that could be referenced there. So it's not a, because Fugue said so, we take you directly to the specific documentation where you could see, why this is recommended and exactly how you need to configure this, to make it compliant. So quick pause there. Any questions?
We don't have any. I posted one in the chat, but I should just kind of throw it out there. Anybody on the call, are you currently using any kind of tool to check your Kubernetes manifests pre-flight for security and compliance, or any kind of infrastructure as code pre-deployment, such as Terraform or CloudFormation? And are there any kind of challenges, use cases, or jobs that you're hoping to kind of learn more about and get done, and why you're here? So if any of the, if you have anything that you're using right now or any challenges you're trying to address, please do pop those in the chat. Would love to put Ricardo to the test and answer your questions.
We'll say try to answer the questions.
Oh, you can always get them.
So this is this other file is pretty extensive. So this was something that I think we pulled offline. So we had this when we were doing some testing internally. But I did this in a compact format just because there are a number of different errors in it. It's a pretty huge file. So there's a bunch of different things that are in this single file. I know in many cases when you are, say, deploying Kubernetes clusters, you would have multiple files maybe defined for different pods, different configurations, different services, just different aspects of Kubernetes that you may have in different files. This we just included in the single file. So this is extremely extensive and has, I want to say 800 plus lines of configuration information there. So there's a lot there to dig into. But ultimately, when we have these sorts of evaluations, we're able to just go through it. We can see this compact format is just going to give us the errors, violations, again, of these Fugue rules here. And then we can go through all of those in detail. So one of the things that that's unique to Fugue, as far as I know, is the ability to actually visualize some of these manifests pre-deployment. And we do that using a Regula scan demand. With our configurations file, we have actually set up an environment that's associated with this repository. So that repository environment has an environment ID. So when we run these, and this is done locally or within your CI system, we can actually do send the evaluation. So all of this information that I'm going to get locally, when I actually set this up in my CI system, I'm actually going to do a Regula scan as well. So what Regula scan does, it actually, if I have custom rules pertaining to whether it's my Kubernetes YAML, whether it's in this case, because I have Terraform, if I have custom rules that are devoted to any sort of Terraform configurations that impact the resources that I'm attempting to deploy, all of those things are pulled down and they're evaluated. So this is actually sending this, so essentially uploading this report into the Fugue UI so that I can view it there. So what that actually gives us is that's centralized visibility. So if we think about it from an administrative standpoint, if I have a number of these different developers that are pushing to different repositories, I want to have some sort of centralized visibility that will allow me to see all of these repository environments. And that's what we have here. So with these repository environments, we can actually send the output of what we just scanned to the Fugue UI for viewing. So if we look at this, we see the most recent scan was just done. If we click into it, now we're going to be able to see the report. So from my perspective, playing the role of an admin, I don't know everything that's going on, but I have all of these repository environments, and they can be structured within the UI based on the business unit, based on the team. So a lot of flexibility with how you might create these things within, within our UI and your platform for your viewing. But ultimately, what we're going to see is these evaluations will break down like this. So anything that we are attempting to deploy, we can view this simply by file path. So if we look at everything that in that larger file that we are deploying, we get details as to why these things are non-compliant. Again, we see that Fugue rule ID is prominent there. We see a number of different evaluations that are being performed on these different resources within this manifest. So all this information, and this will all lead ultimately to the reporting. So as we run these, every time that we perform this scan, this pre-deployment scan, before we even try to deploy this cluster, we are going to get these runs. And this was something that I just created. So we have a scan that we performed earlier. I can view the results of that. The later scan that I just performed, all of those results will be available to me here. And then we get to the visualizer. So now we're able to see, so what are all of those connected relationships with what I am attempting to deploy? That's all going to be there for me visually. I can also see visually any of the violations that are represented. So if we expand this out, this is essentially going to give us the map of what we are attempting to deploy. This other module here, so this is just the EKS cluster that's part of this. And this may be the underlying configurations for what's going into this EKS resource within AWS. But details associated with anything are all clickable as well. We can see pod information. We can see what the compliance violations are. Again, the control. So just having that visual approach, the visual, what we can see, essentially what we're deploying, being able to see that visually is also very powerful. And quite honestly, I don't know if this exists, from a pre-deployment perspective. And I know there are a number of tools within Kubernetes. So I could be completely wrong, but just integrating this with all of my infrastructure as code, having it in a centralized location, being able to report on all of these things. So any sort of violations that I would have associated with any of my repository environments, I'm able to pull that. The Kubernetes deployment I just did, but if we looked at, any of the other repository environments, I can essentially run a report, get any of those violations there. They can be distributed, the reports that we see. When we start thinking about aggregating information and sharing it across our organization, being able to share any of that sort of information with other members of the team for all of our repository environments, those violations are found there. So it's just a tremendous amount of information that we are exposing just by use of Regula. And again, this is use or connecting everything within the Fugue UI as part of the enterprise, the kind of platform offering. But from an open source perspective, everything that we see here is available to you. So you should absolutely take advantage of all the information that is there. Before we run out of time, I did want to jump into the open source repository and kind of walk through that with some of the information that you would be able to see, just to help you as you maybe decide to start writing your own custom rules to evaluate some of the Kubernetes files. But if we go into this Fugue Regula, we'll go into the rules. And then you see the rules that are broken down within between CloudFormation, Terraform, and then Kubernetes. This is going to give you all of the rules that we have. So again, this is open source. You could see the structure of the rules, the way that Fugue pulls those in. What you'll see here is this is essentially a library that we do to structure our Kubernetes rules. So, and I'll show you where you can find that as well. But you'll see the resource declarations and then any sort of policy. So with every evaluation, there's going to be a policy that's going to be associated with it. The policy is going to use this Fugue function, which is an allow resource, fugue.allow resource, and you'll also have a fugue.deny resource. So this is essentially the resource that we're evaluating, and then the specific setting that we would have. So in this case, whatever this host IP set, which you'll see here, as long as it's not that, we're going to allow it. And if it's structured that way, we're going to deny it. So those of you that are familiar with Open Policy Agent, this is something that you're very used to. I think if you are not, getting up to speed with it can happen extremely quickly as you start seeing these rules, viewing the rules, how you would start writing those rules. We also within here is we talk about custom rule development. So writing rules that you would have to evaluate your different resources would be found here. Structure of those rules. So you would see the walkthrough, and this also gives you the built-in functions that we have in our abstraction of Open Policy Agent and our use of the evaluations, which we've extended obviously for pre-deployment as well as post-deployment. The obvious question that we have, that I would have after seeing all of this, is the evaluation of Kubernetes in the runtime environment. That is coming soon. So that is something that we are actively working on and will most likely release in the first half of 2022. So you would see all of that information along with the pre-deployment as well as post-deployment for any of your infrastructure as code files as they move through the process and actually become accounts, be it in Google, Azure, or AWS, and then that same process with any of your Kubernetes YAML files, that evaluation process, and then ultimately into the running cluster environments will all be within the Fugue UI. In terms of that, the other, I guess, area that I wanted to point out for folks is in this library section, is where you can see additional information and reference into structuring resource types when you're writing your Rego. So all of this is open source. Definitely encourage you to take a look, clone it, fork it, give us a star. We appreciate it. So with that, I talked a lot and I'll take a breath. We have questions.
Yeah, so I got a couple in the Q&A rather than chat. Related to your runtime scanning, what about, there was a question about EKS, AWS EKS?
Yes.
And runtime scanning for that, for security?
Yeah, so really good question. So if we think about it across the platform, so let's see, EKS in AWS, AKS in Azure, and GKS in Google. Some of the service providers give us more information than others pertaining to the clusters. We are limited by the API call. So if you think we do a list or describe call for those specific clusters, the information that's returned to us is what we're able to evaluate on. So quite often you'll see permissions related violations, maybe subnet configurations if we're relating a configuration Maybe there's a poorly configured VPC with a subnet that's open to the world and a security group that's open to the world. We would relate that and maybe correlate that back to the cluster, and that would be a violation of whatever, whether it's a internal policy or maybe a best practices policy. That's what you would see there. The actual running cluster is a different control plane, which we are unable to access at this time. That is something that we are working on, and you will see that in a future release in the Fugue UI.
Okay, awesome. And then another is, does Regula work for, I'm going to assume, infrastructure as code tools outside, other than the Kubernetes manifests? So I guess we would be talking about like CloudFormation or Terraform.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So you can inspect any CloudFormation, so JSON or YAML CloudFormation file. Terraform is the HCL code directly. So any .tf file we can inspect. And I also like to highlight that even if there isn't a rule, so you will see a lot of rules that we have across all of the cloud providers. Even if there isn't a rule that pertains to a specific resource type, like Lightsail or some other AWS resource type or any other Azure resource type, I can still write a custom rule that inspects that configuration. So I do want to highlight that, which really extends Regula to being able to evaluate any resource type that you can express in Terraform or CloudFormation for that matter. You just have to have a rule that pertains to it. But yes, so just kind of to answer the question, because I like to give long-winded answers. Any HCL code, if you wanted to do it at the plan, because there's a little more information that's available to you when you run Terraform plan, we can inspect those files as well. And then all of the Kubernetes YAMLs configuration files that you would have.
Awesome. And then one last one I've got here, and please, if you have any questions or comments, pop those into chat before we're the top of the hour. How are you seeing this fit into a typical team workflow, so vis-a-vis the software development lifecycle?
Yeah, really good question. So, and it really is going to impact in a couple of different areas. So the first thing is, I want every developer who's creating infrastructure as code and pushing it to any internal repository, I want them to have Regula at the desktop. And so what this does is, for any sort of best practices for Terraform, for Kubernetes, for CloudFormation, whatever, I'm going to get those evaluations, and I'm going to see anything that I do that's misconfigured. I'm going to get that here. So directly in front of me, I will get any sort of these violations will be brought to my attention. So that's the first thing. And this is, strongly encouraged. Once, and if they don't do that, that's fine. I'm going to create and set up within my repository. So whether it's a GitHub action, whether I'm installing this, creating a Jenkins agent, which I'm going to use and refer to any infrastructure as code repository, we are going to have Regula run that evaluation. So essentially, the same commands that I'm running here, Regula run is going to be set up in we'll use Jenkins as the example, but the command that I'm going to have in my Jenkins file is going to be Regula run. And then I'll have, maybe a severity level. Maybe I include files, rules that I want to evaluate. And maybe I'm just going to disable, the rules that we have out of the box that are part of the binary itself. So my command will look something like this. So it's essentially going to run against any of the infrastructure as code files. It's only going to stop on high or critical severity. And I'm also going to include the rules that I have, whether it's in that agent or in another repository, however I pull those down so that I'm evaluating there, and I'll disable the rules. So we're going to look at our best practices, any violations. It's going to exit 1 if there are violations, or exit 0 if there are no violations. And this is going to, however that communication cycle goes back to the developers, whether they get an email sent with that output report, However, the workflow is that you would have internally, that's how you're going to impact it. So it's a really straightforward workflow. Starting point is I want all of my developers to get in the habit of when they create Terraform files or Kubernetes configuration files to do a regular run against those files every time. Beyond that, I'm going to set it up within my CI that if those violations are found, we're going to stop the build. Information is going to be sent back to the developer and they're going to correct those errors. And that's going to happen before bad stuff is deployed into my production environments. Long-winded answer, but I think it really is important just to paint the picture so that we're very clear on kind of how that workflow is. And this isn't just coming from me. This is coming from working with a number of our customers and setting this up and actually implementing these sorts of workflows in their environments.
Great. Another question. Are you able to fail a build in the CI/CD pipeline if a violation is detected?
Yes. And so that's where we would use those severity levels. So in the same manner, so you're going to dictate exactly what that command is. And you would just set that severity level. So I'll use Jenkins as an example, or we can use code pipeline or any sort of CI system. Whenever you have a stage that runs that exits 1, so which would indicate a failure. So any sort of exit code that's non-zero is going to basically make that is going to fail that specific stage in that pipeline. So you would just use the severity flag here to fail a build. And then whatever information that you would have, that information would get sent back to the person that pushed it or somebody who is responsible for approvals or, whatever stage you want. But you can absolutely incorporate that into any CI system that you're using.
Awesome. Okay. Any last questions? Pop those in, but I'm not seeing any right now.
$12.57. We did it.
We're good. Do you want to? Yeah. Do you want to bring up the deck? We'll close this out.
Yep.
Awesome. Yep. So here we just have a couple of links to go check out. Obviously, the docs are usually where a lot of people want to start. That's regula.dev. It's an awesome doc site. Hat tip to Becky Lee here at Fugue for doing such a fabulous job there. You can find Regula on GitHub. The Docker image on Docker Hub, and definitely explore Open Policy Agent if you haven't. It's a great overall policy as code framework. It's open source, a lot of support behind it, a lot of energy behind it. Definitely, I would say first consideration for any kind of policy as code decisions that you might make at your organization. And then our final plug for Fugue, where I think, with Fugue and our SaaS platform for security and compliance automation kind of helps you tie all of this in together to, it's a next slide to, empower individual engineering teams and developers to check their work and move fast, but centrally be able to manage all of the policies that your teams need to adhere to and make sure that they're doing so. So this is really all about kind of centralized visibility and policy control over everything without slowing teams down, with really empowering all of your cloud engineering and application developers to move as fast and as securely as they possibly can. So with that, I think it's on the next page. We've got, if you want to schedule kind of a one-on-one workshop with Ricardo, talk to our sales team about getting started with Fugue, you can, I think you pop back to the previous slide. There we go. Oh, we've got PowerPoint problems.
There we go.
So what Fugue does is it ties all this in together and gives you kind of a centralized visibility and control across your entire software development lifecycle for cloud infrastructure security, from infrastructure as code through just continuous monitoring and security in the runtime. So look forward to connecting with you. Thank you again. And please do join us next week, Wednesday at noon Eastern, for the Cloud Security Masterclass on minimizing the blast radius of a cloud breach. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.